In the autumn of 1953, four friends set out from Atlanta hoping for a peaceful weekend along the Chattahoochee. They carried just the basics, planned to cast a few lines, and expected nothing more than a quiet night beneath the tall pines. But before the sun dipped below the trees, an unfamiliar voice drifted across the river. It called out a single name, clear, close, yet no one stood on the far bank. When night finally settled, the woods fell completely still. The air grew heavy, and something moved just beyond the edge of the firelight, slow, intentional, watching. By the time we realized something was circling the campsite, it was too late to pretend we had imagined it. So, before we continue, please make sure to leave a like and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. We'd left Atlanta before sunrise that Friday in late September of 1953. I was 24 back then, working shifts at the rail yard and saving most of my check for school. The city had felt cramped all week, so when James suggested getting away to the woods by the Chattahoochee, I agreed right away. We needed a break, a place to fish, sip coffee by a fire, and sleep on the ground with no one nearby. There were four of us packed into the car. James drove his new Chevrolet like it was something precious. He always had a pocket knife on him, kept his boots oiled, and talked more about his old army days than the job he worked now. In the seat beside him was Robert, 10 years older than the rest of us, quiet, and always rubbing his jaw when deep in thought. I sat in the back next to Mary, James's cousin. She watched the road with steady eyes and only spoke when she had something worth saying. We'd brought a canvas tent, bedrolls, an iron skillet, and a cooler. Robert carried a fishing pole and a jar of worms. James had a used .30-30 rifle. He said it was for snakes or whatever trouble we might run into. Mary asked what kind of trouble he expected. James just shrugged and said it never hurt to be prepared. Leaving the city was smooth at first. Then the pavement faded into farmland, old storefronts, and long lines of pines. By mid-morning, we were bouncing down a dirt road, the car rattling over deep ruts. Dust slipped through the windows and coated our lips. James seemed right at home, pointing out barns he recognized and old turns in the road. Robert listened without saying much. Mary stayed quiet, though her eyes scanned every fence line and opening between the trees like she was memorizing the whole route. We stopped once at a small general store for gas and a loaf of bread. The man behind the counter had gray hair and moved slowly as he counted change. He asked where we were headed. James told him we were camping near Miller Bridge. The man's expression stiffened. He said that stretch stayed real quiet this time of year. James replied that was exactly why we liked it. He hesitated, then said to keep the fire bright after dark and not to split up if we needed to walk. He said it like simple advice, but something in his tone lingered. James thanked him and paid, then laughed once we stepped outside, saying old men always had warnings about the woods. Back in the car, Robert didn't laugh. He asked what the man meant. James said it was probably just talk about wild dogs, troublemakers, or nothing at all. Mary turned around in her seat and said the man didn't look bored, he looked afraid. James answered that folks in those parts were naturally jumpy. I listened but said nothing. I didn't want to spoil the trip before it even started. We reached the turn in the river around noon and parked where the dirt road finally ended. From there, we hauled our gear downhill on foot. The narrow path was pressed deep into the clay by deer and old fishermen. The river wasn't wide, but it ran fast over scattered stones. Thickets of cane and alder crowded the banks. The air smelled of wet leaves and mud. There were no cars, no voices, just the rush of the water and the wind moving through the trees. I remember thinking we had stepped into a place separate from the rest of the world, a spot that could hold a person all night and leave no trace. We found a level patch beneath two tall pines. James and Robert put up the tent while I gathered deadwood. Mary arranged stones in a circle for the fire and set the coffee pot beside it. She worked with a sure, steady rhythm, brushing pine needles from her skirt when she finished, like she had done the chore countless times. We had cold ham and bread in the shade. After lunch, Robert headed for the river with his rod. James took the rifle and walked upstream, saying he wanted a better casting spot. Mary and I stayed near camp. She showed me how to tie a line on a spare hook, even though I told her I already knew how. We talked about small things, town, work, the little pieces of life that didn't matter much. She asked about my mother's health and whether I still intended to start night classes. I said yes, and somehow the answer felt good to say out loud. By mid-afternoon, the heat softened and the light turned easy. Robert shouted that he'd caught 2 bream. James returned carrying a burlap sack of catfish. We cleaned the fish on a flat rock near the water, our hands slick with scales. The scraps drifted away down the current. While I rinsed my knife, a voice carried from the trees across the river. It sounded like a man calling out, a single rough, "Hey!" It echoed across the water and then went silent. James heard it too. He straightened and listened hard. Mary asked if someone was over there. Robert scanned the opposite bank. We saw nothing, just thick brush and the curve of the river blocking the view. James said it was probably a fisherman downriver and got back to work. Still, I kept listening, even when nothing followed. We carried the fish to camp. James salted them and dropped them into the skillet. The smell of hot oil rose with the smoke. We ate until we were full, then watched the river darken. The first stars appeared between branches. Somewhere upstream, an owl called twice. I remember thinking it was the kind of night people dream about during long, crowded city summers. After dinner, James stepped into the trees for a moment. He came back fast, his expression tight. He said he'd found fresh hoof prints in the damp soil behind camp. Robert asked if they were from deer. James shook his head, saying they were too large and pressed too deep, more like goat tracks. Mary asked if goats even lived out there. James said farms sometimes lost animals. Robert went to look with him. When they returned, Robert said the prints were recent and trailed toward the river before looping back into the trees. He didn't add much else, but his voice had turned cautious. We tried settling in for the night. The fire burned low and we fed it in turns. Mary unrolled her blanket inside the tent and went in early. Robert and I rolled out near the fire. James and I lingered while the others tried to sleep. His rifle lay across his knees like a comfort. He spoke about coming here as a boy and the tales folks told along the river. One story he mentioned was about something they called the Goat Man. He said the name with a half smile to shake it off, but I noticed him glancing beyond the flames as he talked. James told us folks upriver had long blamed a thing that moved on 2 legs and left cloven tracks, something that could step through the trees without a sound. He mentioned missing stock at first, then people who wandered off and never returned, and once a boy who came back from a picnic 2 days later, unable to say what he saw. Robert pulled his hat back and watched James closely, following every word like a map. James said older fishermen avoided certain bends at dark. I asked if he believed it. He shrugged, saying he'd never seen more than snakes and tracks, that his pa had used the tail to keep him from roaming after dusk. Mary cracked the tent flap and told us we were loud enough for half the forest. James laughed it off and said "Goat Man," loud and joking, as if the sound could push the thought away. Mary didn't laugh. She ducked back inside and fastened the flap. I took off my boots and tried to sleep near the coals. The river, the crickets, and the pop of the fire folded into a soft hum. James offered to take the first watch, out of habit more than anything, and sat, rifle across his lap. Robert lay facing the trees, eyes open. I drifted toward sleep. the small noises of the night carrying me when a single call cut through, short, close, and familiar sounding. It was enough like my name to make my heart jump. Tom. I jerked awake. The sound had come from the tree line behind James, just beyond the glow. James turned and reached for his rifle, his other hand landing on my ankle. "You hear that?" he breathed. I answered yes. My throat felt dry. Robert lifted himself, half awake, and asked what was wrong. Before we could say anything, the same call came again, same pitch, same short beat, only this time it said James's name. "James?" came the clear word from the dark. Mary called from the tent, tired and annoyed, asking what was happening. The voice in the trees had no shape. Mary could not have been in that spot without the zipper giving her away, and she did not sound like the voice. James swung the Robert moved to the back of the tent, scanning ground and brush, then came back to the fire and shook his head. He said he'd seen nothing except her own footprints and those cloven marks. I wanted to say he must have missed something because the other possibility felt worse, but the words lodged in my throat. Mary unzipped the flap and stepped out, sweater pulled tight. She looked from James to me, then toward the dark trees, and asked again what had happened. James offered that it was probably sound carrying from downriver, that we'd misheard names. Robert watched him carefully as he said it. Mary didn't argue, but she stayed by the fire instead of returning to her blanket. We sat longer than planned, the rifle close. The night stretched thin and quiet. Every stick and small noise seemed louder. Then, beyond the firelight, something moved slowly, too deliberate to be an animal, just out of sight. We heard little snaps and a dragging that seemed to circle the clearing. The firelight trembled as if something breathed near its edge. We held our breath. It lasted only a few minutes, a slow walk around the camp, but the rhythm of it was wrong, too measured, like someone sizing us up. The smell changed then, a sharp, sour note under the smoke. James stood up and swept the light over the trees. "Who's out there?" he called, voice steady, hard as he could. No answer came, only the river and the rustle of leaves. The dragging stopped, the air cooled, and for a moment it felt like the whole world had held its breath with us. Then, from the trees across the water, a voice spoke again, soft, close, and plain. It said one single name, Tom. The sound was clear as a bell and cut the night so cleanly I felt it inside my chest. James's face went pale. He put his hand on the rifle until his knuckles whitened. None of us moved. For a long minute, everything was still except the river. Then a low, wet scraping came from the bank where the hoofprints began. We heard nothing else. No footsteps across the grass, no crunch of leaves, just that slow, sickening scrape. Robert whispered that the tracks led down to the water and stopped. James said we should pack up and go, but the car was a half hour away by foot, and the thought of moving through that dark put a weight in our chests. Mary started to cry softly. We piled the gear, shoved our sleeping things into packs, and tried to move quick and quiet. The fire died down as we worked. Every shadow felt wrong. By the time we reached the bend in the river, something had come close enough to touch the edge of the clearing. Mary piled more wood on the fire than necessary. The yellow flames stretched further, pushing the darkness back a few more yards. It gave me little comfort. The memory of that voice in the trees lingered. As time passed, the night grew heavy over us. Robert said we wouldn't be good for hiking or fishing if we didn't rest. James agreed, and we loosely set a schedule. Robert took the rifle for the next stretch and leaned against a pine. James and I went into the tent with Mary. She lay between us, canvas low over our faces, the smell of smoke clinging to our clothes. She whispered, asking if we were in danger. I said no, though it felt wrong. James shrugged it off, saying it was probably just pranksters or a drunk wandering the woods, and that two armed men could handle that. She wasn't convinced, but went quiet. I slept in short bursts, waking once to hear Robert's boots crunching needles near the edge of camp. Nothing else came. I drifted off again. When I woke the second time, dawn was breaking. The fire was mostly ash. James added branches to the coals, while Robert sat nearby with the rifle across his knees. Silence hung at first. Mary stepped out, rubbing her eyes. She asked if anything else had happened during the night. Robert said no voices, but there were other signs. He pointed toward the back trees. In the sandy soil were more tracks, deeper, covering the paths we had walked at dusk. Some came within yards of the tent. The spacing showed a long stride. Robert said the tracks formed a circle. Whoever it was had walked around us while we slept. James crouched and examined the prints. He repeated they weren't deer. The edges were sharp, the weight heavy. He stood, looking where they led, away from camp, toward thicker trees casting heavy shadows. Mary crossed her arms, insisting we pack and leave. The weekend wasn't worth this. I agreed silently. James frowned, saying there was no reason to rush, not over a prank. He suggested cooking breakfast and seeing how the day felt. Robert stayed neutral, advising we eat before making decisions. He went to the river to wash his hands. I followed. The air was cool near the water, smelling of wet stone. We knelt and rinsed the dirt from our fingers. Then a different scent hit, a sour, heavy odor, like something damp, unwashed and large. I turned, expecting an animal, but the trees were empty. Robert stiffened, saying it wasn't skunk or rot, but something in between, belonging to a large creature that never bathed. The smell lingered at the back of my throat until a river breeze thinned it. We returned silently. Mary had the skillet ready, cracking eggs over the remaining fish fat, her eyes flicking to the trees more than the food. James tried conversation, recalling childhood trips and harmless scares. His energy contrasted with the tightness around his eyes. I watched all of them as I ate. Mary stayed tense. Robert scanned the tree line. James pretended it was a normal trip. The voice never came up again, though it lingered behind every word. After breakfast, Mary insisted again we leave. She argued the old storekeeper's warning, the tracks, sounds, and smell pointed to something real. James countered the river was calm, weather good, men had camped there for years and we were armed. He accused Mary of letting stories rule her imagination. Her jaw clenched and eyes hardened, clearly not forgiving easily. Robert suggested staying one more day, deciding in the morning whether to pack out. Mary asked my opinion. I said we could stay through the afternoon and then judge, more reluctance than courage. We cleaned camp, hung remaining food from a branch, and debated exploring the hoofprint trail. Mary refused to leave the riverbank. Robert warned against splitting up. We compromised. James and I would scout briefly into the woods while Mary and Robert stayed near the river. Robert checked the rifle and handed it to me. James laughed, calling us soldiers on patrol. I didn't share his humor. We stepped into the trees following the hoofprints as the ground rose, drier than the riverbank. The understory thickened, branches pressing close. The sound of the river faded behind us as the forest swallowed the path. The ground felt uneven as we climbed, and the prints became clearer where fallen needles had been pressed aside. The spacing between steps stayed long, farther apart than any human could manage. James led with a steady pace, scanning between trunks. I trailed a few feet behind, watching the path ahead and the shadows to our right, where darkness seemed heavier. We reached a small rise where the undergrowth thinned. The prints changed direction, angling deeper into the woods. James crouched and ran a hand along the edge of one print, fingers spread to show its width. The split was wide, the edges intact, as if whatever made them placed its weight deliberately. "Something big," he murmured. I nodded, stomach tightening at how fresh the marks appeared. Loose dirt still clung, untouched by wind or falling needles. James asked if we should keep going. I hesitated. The river was gone from view and the slope blocked our sight of camp. Every direction looked the same.
Suggested we turn back and tell the others. James agreed, but cast one last glance into the trees, tilting his head as if catching a sound. We walked back faster, the air heavier than before. At one point, I thought a branch shifted to our left. James paused, hand raised. We listened. Nothing followed. Once the slope flattened near the river, the air changed again, carrying the same sour, heavy smell from earlier, thick enough to make me shorten my breaths. James stiffened. "We should hurry," he said. Relief came when the river reappeared, but only briefly. Robert and Mary stood by the water with the tent between them. Robert held the mallet, scanning the trees. Mary clutched her jacket. They watched as we emerged. Mary asked what we'd found. James said only that the tracks went deeper, and we hadn't gone far. Robert asked if they noticed anything following. James denied it, his confidence gone. I stayed silent. Mary pointed to the far bank. Something had passed through the brush while we were gone. Branches shook, and she glimpsed something tall, upright, moving on the slope. Robert added the movement was quick, controlled, not like a deer. James asked why they didn't call out. Robert said it stayed away. They didn't want attention. Mary said the smell spread immediately afterward, then faded. We stood together, uneasy, staring across the river. The opposite bank looked undisturbed, yet silence made me anxious. James shifted the rifle to his right hand, suggesting we stay near camp until midday, then decide whether to leave. Mary didn't reply. Tension remained. Back at camp, we stayed close. Robert checked the clearing for new tracks. None. Mary packed gear quickly, ready for sudden departure. James paced near the pines, scanning the perimeter. I watched everyone, trying to calm the unrest in my chest. It didn't ease. Around noon, the air warmed, yet the woods remained quiet. Even the birds that had sung at dawn avoided our clearing. James suggested walking downstream together to scout a better campsite, claiming animals might be attracted to our current spot. No one argued, but no one wanted to wander far. Robert recommended staying along the riverbank to remain near water and make returning to the car easier. James agreed. Mary insisted we take everything with us. She didn't want to return later for equipment. James frowned, but said nothing. We took down the tent and packed quickly. Every snap and clank echoed through the trees. When the last gear was in our packs, we walked downstream single file. Robert led, mallet tucked in his belt. James followed, rifle ready. Mary trailed behind me, silent, glancing back often. The river murmured to our left. Soft ground showed our footprints, visible to anything watching. James said it didn't matter. I didn't believe him. The path narrowed between river and dense trees. We slowed. A fallen branch lay across the trail. Robert stepped over. James followed. When I lifted my foot, something cracked in the brush ahead and to the right. A heavy snap of brittle wood, far too strong for a small animal. "Stop," Robert whispered. We froze. Mary stood behind me, holding her breath. James angled the rifle toward the noise. The bushes ahead shifted slightly, as if something heavy pressed against them. Then the stench hit us, a wet, sour odor that made my stomach tighten. James called out, telling whoever was there to show themselves. Nothing answered. The brush stayed still, but the smell thickened, crawling along the ground like warm, damp air rolling downhill. Robert motioned for us to back up. Step by careful step, we retreated along the trail, keeping balance over the fallen branch. The brush didn't move. The smell lingered. Once we reached a wider spot, James exhaled and lowered the rifle. He urged we put distance between us and that place. Mary asked if he had seen anything. He shook his head, avoiding her eyes. His grip on the rifle was tight, knuckles white. We moved silently. I kept glancing at the trees on our right, feeling watched. Mary touched my shoulder and whispered if I felt it too. I nodded. No point in pretending otherwise. At a bend, the land opened into a small clearing. Robert suggested resting briefly. Mary hesitated, but James insisted on a short break to drink water. We dropped our packs, forming a loose circle, facing outward. Sunlight turned the shallow river pale. I sipped water, trying to calm my racing heart. Robert pointed across the river, thinking he saw movement behind a stump. Nothing moved. James suggested it was a deer. Robert stayed fixed on the spot, unconvinced. The tension thickened. Then, a single knock echoed behind us, sharp, deliberate, not a branch or animal. The impact echoed, then silence. Mary gasped. Robert gripped the mallet. James raised the rifle. Shadows filled the trees. Another knock. Same sound. Closer. A third knock. Even closer. Without speaking, we grabbed our packs. James instructed us to stay tight and head upriver toward the car. Robert stayed close behind Mary. I stayed beside James. The forest went silent. The smell followed, faint, unmistakable. About 30 yards in, we heard heavy footsteps in leaves behind us. Slow, deliberate, not in a hurry. We didn't look back, only walked faster, following the river upstream. Brush scraped sleeves. The river's rushing sounded muted, as if the forest absorbed it. The footsteps stayed steady. James told us to stop. We froze. The footsteps stopped too. A breeze lifted the scent again, thicker now. James motioned to rocks near the river. We crouched behind them. Robert held the mallet tight. James steadied the rifle. Mary covered her mouth to stay silent. I leaned forward between the trees. For long moments, nothing. Then branches shifted 20 yards back. A tall shape appeared, half hidden. Dark, coarse fur, legs bent backward, a long, narrow head with curved horns. Massive, motionless, deliberate, watching. James whispered to keep moving, slowly, no running. We rose carefully, eyes locked on the trees.
The creature stayed half-shadowed, showing presence but no intent. The damp smell stretched across the clearing. We moved again, faster this time. The tracks along the river grew familiar as we neared camp. Sunlight broke through the thinning trees, giving me a momentary breath of relief, but the footsteps returned as we climbed the slope toward our original site. They were closer now, heavier, coming in measured pairs, pausing, then pairs again, as if deciding how close to follow. At the clearing, the fire pit and scattered pine needles looked untouched. Nothing had disturbed the place where we slept, yet the air felt different, thick with tension. Robert checked for new tracks, shoulders dropping slightly when he found none, jaw still tight. James said we needed to reach the car before dusk. Mary agreed immediately, tightening her pack straps and motioning for us to climb. I followed close behind her, James behind me, Robert at the rear. The trail rose steeply, twisting between low brush and exposed roots. Behind us, the forest went quiet. I expected the smell or heavy steps to return, but only our breaths and the faint river sound accompanied us. At a midpoint, the trail leveled. New tracks cut across it, deep, fresh, pressed through the topsoil into compact earth. James knelt, examining the edge. "No more than an hour old," he murmured. Mary backed away, covering her mouth. Robert stood silently. The tracks led both down toward the river and uphill toward the car. That stopped us. James gripped the rifle, expression tense. Mary whispered we should run the rest of the way. Robert shook his head. Running blind could be worse. James agreed. Steady, close, noisy, so nothing could approach unseen. We resumed climbing. The trees thinned. Sunlight broke through. I focused on each step, keeping Mary close. James scanned the trail's edges. Robert checked behind us. Near the slope's top, the smell returned, stronger, rolling down from above. Mary whispered my name. James raised the rifle halfway. Robert gripped the mallet, knuckles white. Something scraped bark ahead, slightly right. A slow drag. Another. then silence. James mouthed to move left toward open ground near the car. The trail widened. Sunlight lit the ground. Tight group, tense muscles, heavy heartbeats. The scent thickened, making breathing hard. Around the bend, the car came into view, parked under tall pines. Relief struck briefly, then movement. A tall figure stepped between two pines, half lit by sunlight. Legs bent backward, ending in dark hooves. Torso thick with fur, arms long and clawed, head with a narrow snout and curved horns. Eyes glowed red, faint but unmistakable. Mary gasped sharply. James raised the rifle fully. Robert muttered, tightening his grip. I froze into the eyes. The creature stepped forward, slow, heavy. Ground thudded softly. James shouted for it to stop. No response. Another step. James fired. The shot echoed. Birds erupted, scattering. The creature jerked back, then retreated into the trees. No cry, no stumble, just disappeared. Mary grabbed my arm, whispering we had to reach the car. Robert nodded. James hesitated, still aiming, then lowered the rifle. We moved fast but steady. The forest stayed quiet except for leaves settling. The smell faded, but tension remained. At the car, James ordered everyone inside. Mary climbed into the back. I slid next to her, Robert in the passenger seat. James scanned the tree line one last time. Nothing moved. He started the engine and pressed the gas. The tires spun in loose pine needles before catching traction. The car shot forward up the last stretch of dirt road. Silence filled the vehicle as trees on either side blurred past. Halfway up, a loud crack echoed behind us, a deep strike against wood. Another followed, then another, each faster than the last, as though it was chasing us up the hill. James pressed the gas. The knocks grew distant, and then stopped entirely. At the main road, he didn't slow, heading straight for town. Only then did anyone speak. Mary whispered that she saw its eyes tracking us even after the shot. Robert said we should never go back. James kept a firm grip on the wheel, eyes ahead. None of us dared look behind us. As trees thinned and the road widened, the tension loosened slightly, but none of us relaxed. Sunlight looked pale and distant. The engine's hum felt unnaturally loud. Mary wiped her eyes. Robert cracked a window for fresh air. I kept my gaze on the passing woods. After several miles, James pulled over at a gravel turnout by an abandoned feed store. He stopped, hands trembling slightly as he lifted them from the wheel. Robert urged continuing, but James shook his head and stepped out. We followed, Mary hugging the car door, eyes scanning the tree line. The feed store was dilapidated, warped boards, broken windows, a sagging roof. It looked untouched for years. James leaned on the hood, breathing deeply, sweat soaking his back. He asked if any of us saw the creature react to the shot. Robert said it jerked, but didn't fall. I agreed. Mary added that its eyes never changed even when hit. James stared at the gravel, scraping his boot. He murmured, "The bullet should have dropped most things at that range." Robert suggested it might have only been grazed. James said nothing. Mary asked if we were safe now. Robert claimed the moving car kept it away, but sounded unsure. James straightened, ordering us back in. Before starting the car, he warned that we should tell no one what happened. Locals wouldn't believe it, and we didn't need the trouble. Robert agreed. Mary nodded silently. I understood without speaking. Driving into town, everything seemed familiar, yet strange under the memory of those tracks and glowing eyes. Houses, children playing, a man loading lumber, all normal but shadowed by the experience. The smell drifted back in my mind, heavy, damp, unmistakable. Nothing about the encounter had been a mistake. We stopped at a diner on the edge of town. Flickering sign, half-full booths, frying fat in the air. James needed coffee. We took a corner booth. The waitress asked if we'd been camping.
James said yes, adding vaguely that the trip hadn't gone well. She asked why. He said trouble with animals. Mary asked if anyone should be warned about the river woods. Robert said no, anyone who went that far already knew the stories. Mary asked my opinion. I said the creature didn't attack. It watched, followed, tested, but never struck. Mary asked if that meant anything. I didn't know. James downed his coffee, stating that the creature might want something else, leaving it unspoken. The silence was heavier than the woods themselves. James dropped Mary at her home. She hugged us quickly, then went inside. Robert exited next, saying he'd check in tomorrow, standing silently until we left. With just James and me, the car felt too quiet. He drove slowly, then stopped at my driveway. Before I opened the door, he grabbed my arm, asking me not to tell anyone the details. The fewer who know, the better, he said. He said he kept replaying the moment in his head, how the creature didn't fall. He wondered aloud if it had learned what guns were for.
Maybe that was why it slipped behind the trees right after the bullet hit. I didn't know what to say, so I stayed silent. He loosened his grip on my arm. I stepped out and walked toward my front door. I didn't turn back until I heard the sound of his engine fading away. I spent the rest of the evening inside. My mother asked why I looked exhausted. I told her we'd hiked far and hadn't slept well. She didn't ask more. Later, lying in bed, I couldn't stop remembering how the creature stood motionless, watching us. Every time I closed my eyes, the smell came back, heavy and damp. I tried convincing myself that being home meant being safe, but the next morning, when I stepped outside, something waited on my porch. A deep, fresh hoofprint pressed into the soft dirt. My breath stalled. The print was wide, newly made, the soil disturbed around the edges. I knelt and touched it. The edges were still firm, untouched by wind. I stood quickly, heart tightening, and scanned the yard. Nothing moved. The street was empty. A neighbor's dog barked 2 houses down, but the sound didn't comfort me. I went back inside, locked the door, and stood by the window. James showed up 20 minutes later, likely seeing my house on his drive to town. He didn't call first. When he saw my face, he asked what happened. I showed him the print. He crouched down, studying it silently. His jaw tightened. When he stood, he looked around the yard the same way he stared into the trees the day before. He said it must have followed the car. I asked how far something like that could travel. James said it moved faster than they did and didn't rest like people. Robert arrived soon after because James had contacted him. He knelt by the print and cursed under his breath. He said it shouldn't be able to stay in town without someone noticing. James replied that not everything left tracks where people looked. I listened silently, hands shaking. Mary came later after James called her. When she saw the print, she covered her mouth the same way she had by the river. She asked why it had come here. No one answered. We went inside and shut every window and door. James said we needed a plan. Robert suggested finding someone who knew old local stories, maybe the storekeeper. James refused. He didn't want rumors spreading or the sheriff getting involved. Mary said she didn't care about rumors if the creature was near town. Their arguing grew tense. I listened to their voices and felt pressure building in my chest. I thought about the way the creature watched us in the woods, how it followed without rushing, how it stepped out only when we were trapped. A thought I didn't want to say out loud came to me. The creature never attacked us. It followed, it watched, it knocked, it copied sounds, but it never lunged. I said, maybe it didn't leave because it was waiting for something or someone. Mary stared. James looked away. Robert asked what I meant. I didn't answer. Saying it out loud meant admitting something I didn't want to accept. It had spoken my name first. Robert straightened. Mary's breathing shifted sharp and tight. James's jaw clenched. No one argued. No one said I was wrong. The room felt too small then, like the walls were closing in. James finally said the print could have been left before dawn, meaning the creature might already be gone. His voice tried to sound steady, but wasn't. Robert suggested checking around the house to be sure it wasn't nearby. Mary stayed inside, arms crossed, leaning against the wall. James and Robert stepped onto the porch with the rifle. I followed, even though part of me wanted to stay inside with the door shut. The morning air was cool, the street still. A few leaves drifted across the yard. At first, nothing seemed out of place. We circled the house. James checked each window and path between trees. Robert searched the ground for prints. At the back fence, Robert called out. We joined him. More tracks, 3 deep impressions spaced far apart. They followed the fence line, then angled toward the tree line at the neighborhood's edge. The last print faced the woods, as if it had paused before leaving. James crouched and touched the soil. His voice dropped low. He said it wasn't hiding, it had been watching. Robert stayed silent, jaw tight. Mary called out from the porch, asking if it was still there. James told her no, the tracks headed away, and we wouldn't see it again. But when he looked at me, his eyes didn't match his words. It had followed us. It had stood in my yard. It left when it wanted. Inside, Mary sat at the kitchen table, hands clasped. She looked at me the same way she did when we cleaned fish at the river. She asked how long I had been awake before noticing the print. I told her I saw it the moment I stepped outside. She gave a small nod, asking nothing more. Robert suggested we go back to the storekeeper and tell him everything we'd witnessed. Maybe the old man knew more than he pretended. James shut that down immediately. He said the moment the old man heard it, half the town would know by sundown. And once word spread, hunters would be out there searching for whatever was walking in those woods. Robert said maybe letting hunters handle it wasn't the worst idea. James argued it might pull the danger closer instead of pushing it away. Their voices rose. The room tightened. I finally told them to cut it out. They both stared at me. My throat felt thick, but I spoke anyway. I said whatever we had seen wasn't something regular people or hunters could handle. It followed trails we never noticed, moved without a sound unless it wanted us to hear it, and stood in ways nothing natural stood. A bullet barely slowed it down. Mary whispered that some things weren't meant to be understood. Then she asked, almost afraid to breathe, if it would come for us again. Robert said no, too quickly. James echoed him, just as fast, just as unconvincing. I told them I didn't think it wanted any of them. I said I had a feeling it wanted me. Silence locked the room. James set the rifle on the counter and asked me to explain. I told him the truth. The voice in the trees had called my name first, clear, deliberate, long before we saw the prints circling our tent. That wasn't an accident. Mary closed her eyes. Robert blew out a breath and looked away. James paced once, then stopped in front of me and asked if I believed calling my name meant it wanted me to get away. I told him I didn't know. Maybe it wanted me to step away from the group, or walk into the trees, or look somewhere I shouldn't. And I said it tried again the next morning, judging by the tracks around my house. Mary asked what would happen if I left town. Maybe go stay with family out west or with Robert's cousin in Augusta. I told her running wouldn't work. It had already followed me home. Something like that didn't seem limited by distance. We sat there for a long time, saying nothing. Normal sounds drifted in, the ticking clock, a car rolling by, but none of it eased the tightness in the room. James said he'd stay with me that night. Robert said he would too. Mary promised she'd return with blankets and food. I told them they didn't need to. James said no one was being left alone after what we witnessed. They stayed through the afternoon. We talked about ordinary things, weather, work, local news. No one said a word about the woods. The rifle never left the table. As night crept in, Mary came back carrying blankets and lanterns. We gathered in the living room with the curtains drawn tight and one lamp burning. Their presence warmed the room, but tension clung to me like a second skin. Every hour or so, one of us checked a door or window. Nothing changed. No movement, no smell, no sound in the yard. By midnight, Mary had drifted asleep. Robert rested with his eyes shut, not quite sleeping. James sat by the window with the rifle across his lap. I stayed near the hallway, unable to relax. Sometime after 2 a.m., a sound drifted through the yard. One hollow knock, as if wood had tapped wood. Light, distant, but enough to freeze every muscle. We waited. No second knock, no footsteps, nothing. James said it was probably just a branch falling. Nobody challenged him. We stayed awake until dawn. Daylight didn't calm me much, but it made the house feel less like a box. Mary left to check on her aunt. Robert headed home, promising to come back later. James lingered an hour before leaving for work. When they were all gone, I stood in the doorway wondering if stepping outside was an invitation. The yard looked ordinary. The print near the porch had dried out. The fence line tracks had faded. The street was quiet. The day passed uneventfully. So did the next and the next. No prints, no knocks.